is the concept of that there's somebody to be reciprocal with. There is a person rather than an issue, rather than a problem. And so the issue of interdependence can only take place at an individual level, rather than some kind of homogenized problem level or aggregated level. Joachim, a Christian who I mentioned, God of the empty-handed, he makes the comment, poverty is and always will be a human phenomenon. In spite of all the efforts to reduce it to a mere statistic or concept, its human face can never be washed away. Now, we see poverty, it's ponderous, it weighs us down, and so we do indeed reduce it to statistics. We reduce it to stereotypes. Now, there was a time when we used to talk about the poor. We now understand, of course, that that's offensive. We shouldn't be saying that. We should not be so homogenizing and massing people together into a lump and mass that we call them the poor. So we have a nice solution for that. In our ponderous thinking, we call them the low socioeconomic. Now, I have to tell you, I really, over the years, have developed a deep allergic reaction to the phrase low socioeconomic. I was brought to that point by a person I met in the community once who was an uneducated person, but a very active person for change in her community, actively doing things to help others. No benefit to herself out of this. She actually believed in the community where she lived, and we were having a wonderful conversation, and until I put my foot right in my mouth, right down to my stomach. I said, yes, we live in a low socioeconomic area. And she said, drove down my throat like a Big Mack truck and said, we live in a low economic area, thank you very much. We don't live in a low socio area. Socio and economic don't go together. There are different issues involved there. Yes, we've got social problems here, but I can tell you in the high economic areas, they've got social problems too. They may or may not be the same, but you cannot link. And if you do link, you have suddenly denied my individuality and the individuality of these in this community. And she was absolutely right. So the whole concept of reducing people to statistics or classifications becomes a dreadful outcome of being tied to a world that fundamentally sees things in a very utilitarian way. I'm very moved by one shouldn't have favourite verses in the Bible, so I don't, but anyway. One section that I am nevertheless impacted by quite a lot is Matthew 25, the Inasmuch sermon. And the Inasmuch sermon is, it says all the things that can be very sweet and nice, and we can feel very warm as we go out into the world to work in the world. Feed the hungry, provide water to the thirsty, provide shelter to the homeless, welcome the stranger at the gate, visit the sick, and visit the prisoner. And we can do all that reactively. But if we do all that reactively, we are in fact being tied, like the donkey, to the world, if that's all we're doing. Craig Carter, in his book Rethinking Christ and Culture, a Post-Christendom Perspective, talks about the fact that in the post-Christendom world, the church has very often been reduced to be nothing other than the chaplaincy to the post-Christian West. In the temporal reality to which we are tied, there will be people who will be the victims of that, thrown aside by that world. But it's okay. We've got this nice little group called the Christians who will be there to be band-aid merchants to these people. And if we tick that box, then we are being reactive and we are, like the donkey, tied to that world. So how do we deal with that? Well, what we do is we go into a space that is a quite different space. We must be reactive, of course. I'm not saying we shouldn't be delivering food and water and visiting the sick, and by the way, dealing with the unacceptable marginalized in the eyes of many people, the stranger at the gate, the prisoner, and so on. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing all that. Of course we should. But if that's where we leave the proposition, then we remain deeply tied. we need to be looking at the prophetic space. We need to be saying, we happen to know that the kingdom calls for something better than this. When Jesus gave us the prayer, your kingdom come, he anticipated that we can pray for that. And in that prophetic call, we're called to a much bigger space altogether. Now, again, coming back to a World Vision story. I was CEO of World Vision Australia before I went to Asia. And one year, the international president, Dean Hirsch, said to all the national directors who were in fundraising offices, I want you to go back to your countries, talk to your marketing teams, and I want you to raise lots of money for HIV/AIDS, because there is an explosion happening in Africa, and there's about to be an explosion happening in Asia, and we need to be there. So go back and ask your marketers, how can we raise lots of money to spend on this program? So I went back and I talked to my marketers, and all the other people did too, and at the end of a period of time, my marketers came back to me and they said, Lynn, look, we understand what you want, and we understand the importance of it. Don't get us wrong. We understand how really critically important this is. We must be there for these people to help them. But, you know, people in the community of Australia don't want to know about it. They actually have all sorts of attitudes about HIV/AIDS. They feel that they're guilty, these people who've got AIDS, and there's many other more just causes that you would give to than to people who have AIDS. So they said, but Lynn, don't get depressed. It's okay. We've worked out another program. We've got another program we can raise money for that is not committed to anything in particular, and it's going to be a really jazzy program, and the money will be free for you to use as you want. You just don't have to tell anybody. But it'll be genuinely quite full of integrity and transparency. You can use this money for HIV/AIDS. So you go back and tell the international president that. So I went back and I did precisely that. I told that to the international president. And then my colleague from Canada got up and he said the same, and my colleague from the UK got up and he said the same, and I'm sorry, John, my colleague from New Zealand got up and said the same, and my colleague from Taiwan and Korea, who were fundraising officers, got up and said the same. And then my colleague from the US, Rich Stearns, got up, and I said, okay, here we go, we're going to hear the same thing again. And he said, oh, so your marketers told you that you couldn't do it. My marketers said exactly the same to me. So he said, I said to my marketers, are you telling me the wind's blowing in the wrong direction? And they said, yes, if you want to describe it that way, that's what's happening. The wind's blowing in the wrong direction. Yeah, that works as a metaphor. So Rich then said, well, why don't we change the direction of the wind? Which is a very easy, slick statement to say. Except that this guy, who headed up the largest entity in the World Vision family, dedicated a huge proportion of his time for the following 12 months as he traipsed around the constituency that supported World Vision US most, and in their case, World Vision Australia and New Zealand are much more across the wider community in terms of support. World Vision US is amongst a certain section of evangelical Christendom as its main heartland. He did that for a year, and he raised huge sums of money. He actually overcame the issue of prejudice from many Christians about HIV/AIDS. And we know how powerful that was because 2 years later there was a survey done in America that surveyed Americans on different attitudes to foreign aid. And one of the things they were asked is, should the American government give money to HIV/AIDS? The average for the population was 64%. Secular people were way up there in about 72%. Jews were up in the 70s. Black Christians were up in the 70s. Evangelicals, by and large, were way down in the 40s. The Mormons were way down in the 40s. But the whole population average was 62. One exceptional group of evangelical Christians, however, which happened to be the heartland of World Vision US efforts, was 75% yes. It was equal biggest yes vote. Rich Stearns had actually proved that you could take the direction of the wind on and you could change it. And so I raise that point now because essentially that it becomes the untying of our mission from the world, but not just letting it float loose, but tying it to who? Tying it to none other than Jesus and God. Kuma Christian again goes on to talk about kingdom power rereads history from God's perspective. It creates a covenant community, is inclusive, is based on truth, clarifies identity, defines itself as powerlessness, and confronts principalities and power. But how? For who? And with who? Each of these marks of kingdom power redefines the very notion of power itself. The nature of power itself is transformed. A transformation, a wind change if you like, that will equip the powerless to know the power of the kingdom cannot happen without the intervention of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm running out of time, so I have to be conscious to not go on too long. Returning to the theme of being untied, to whom or to what do we seek to reconnect our moorings? We can be tied, even with the best effort in the world, to the utilitarian perspective of the world, to the worldly view of the neighbour as somebody useful to yourself, to the worldly view that we will be just reactive, or we can tie ourselves to the kingdom concepts of a power that transforms, of a power that does see the neighbour as ourselves, as the phrase goes. And that when we see Matthew 25, we don't just read Jesus as saying, by the way, if you give food to the hungry, and if you give water to the thirsty, and if you visit the sick, and if you welcome the stranger at the gate, and if you visit the prisoner, that's nice. He didn't say that. He said, you did it to me. You did it to the king, in fact, is what those verses say. In other words, we see within the powerlessness of these people the king. We see the prophetic call to the kingdom, not just a reactive response to the needs. The Korean writer C.S. Song, he relates the story of the gold-crowned Jesus by the Korean poet Kim Chi-ha. In that story there are three protagonists. There is the leper, there is the beggar, and there is a statue of a Christ Pietà figure with a gold crown. Song describes the situation in the terms of defining, in answering the question, where is Jesus, looking from the point of view of the leper and the beggar. And of all people, it is the beggar and leper, the two wretched souls, the scum of society, and not theologians who teach Christian doctrines. Not Christians who know their catechisms by heart who ask the question. When a theologian raises it, it becomes a theological question to be settled but with massive knowledge of biblical interpretation and church teaching. When a sophisticated Christian asks it, the question turns into the defense of the Christian faith against other faith. But when a beggar turns to the question, it is not his head or his faith that turns to it. It is the stomach, his empty stomach. And when a leper asks the question, his immediate concern is not the defense of faith and current doctrine. What is at stake is his humanity. The humanity eaten away by the horrible disease and excluded from human community. Neither of them have a theological axe to grind. For them is a question of life and death. The question of whether love is strong enough to fill an empty stomach, to restore a disfigured humanity, to create life in the midst of death. The climax comes when both the leper and beggar realize that the statue is not the real Jesus, the statue with the gold crown. This false Jesus is adulterated by the riches of the world, venerated through pompous liturgy. And when that realization comes, Song writes of the story, the cement Jesus opens his mouth and speaks. I have been closed up in this stone for a long, long time, entombed in this dark, lonely, suffocating prison. I have longed to talk with you, the kind and poor people like yourself, and share your suffering. I can't tell you how long I've waited for this day when I would be freed from my prison, this day of liberation when I would live and burn again as a flame inside you, inside the very depths of your misery. But now you have finally come. And because you have come close to me, I can speak now. You are my rescue. The song goes on to write, at last the real Jesus has spoken. The gold crown has vanished from his head. He now wears a crown of thorns. And he says, a very strange thing happens here. Too strange for many of us to grasp, and so strange that those who know Jesus only as a prophet, a priest, and king cannot comprehend. But the change is decisive. People must explain who Jesus is. People are to reveal where Jesus is. Jesus does not tell people why they suffer. It is the people who tell Jesus why he has to suffer. And people must liberate Jesus before Jesus can burn again as a flame inside them. The people who are determined to tell who Jesus is, to disclose where he is, and the people who struggle to liberate Jesus, Jesus calls them the blessed. So here in the prophetic power of Matthew 25, where we see not just those to be helped as separate beings, but as the eyes of the king in the eyes of the marginalized, we encounter the crowned king with the suffering poor. We discover Emmanuel. For us to make this discovery, we must untie the donkey of our faith from the world, from ourselves, and not wander aimlessly, but tie it to this real Jesus.